Hello, I'm Gadi Taub. I'm a historian and author and also co-host of the podcast Israel Update. And this is 18 Questions, 40 Israeli Thinkers from 1840.
So we'll begin where we always begin. As an Israeli and as a Jew, how are you feeling at this moment in Israeli history?
I think that for the first time since 1973, most Israelis realize that the existence of the State of Israel is in real and serious danger. And what is unique about this time is that those of us who do not understand this are busy trying to fray the elements of solidarity behind Zionism and behind the Jewish people in general.
What do you mean by that?
There is an elite that has a dream of what it sees as progressive normality, and which sees anything Jewish, except maybe the Hebrew language, as a threat to that dream. So in the words of sharp pundit Irit Linur, they are dreaming of a Sweden in Hebrew, and October 7th was a serious setback to that dream.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
I just did a piece for JNS, and I'm working on a Hebrew version of it. And I find it hard to convey to people that they have been saying that the real enemy is not Hamas, it's Netanyahu and his government. And until you bring the actual quotes, people don't believe you that this is what they're saying. In their view, Hamas is a problem we can deal with. The problem they can't deal with is that they are becoming a demographic minority, and the way they imagine the right is not far from the way liberals in the United States imagine Donald Trump. So fascism, religious fundamentalism, even something approaching Nazism is upon us. And those terrible, deplorable hordes are going to drown their brand of Zionism, the liberal progressive brand of Zionism, which is a Sweden in Hebrew, in a tide of backwardness and darkness.
What do you think, or what has been Israel's greatest success and greatest mistake in the current war against Hamas?
I think that Israel's success is the insistence on winning this war, and then the insistence that this war is not another chapter in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's actually chapter 2 or round 2 in the ongoing war against Iran. The first chapter was 2006, when we thought we were fighting Hezbollah, or most of us thought we were fighting only Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. We did not completely understand the way Iran was planning its drive to hegemony in the region. We were all focused on the nuclear threats, and therefore Israelis, if you just got an Israeli on the street and asked them, what is the existential threat? It's that the Iranians will use a bomb on us. But that was not their plan. The bomb or the nuclear program is just an umbrella for a very smart plan to defeat the state of Israel with conventional weapons, and primitive ones at that. One smart analyst, or two smart analysts at the Hudson Institute, my co-host in Israel Update, Mike Duran, and his colleague, John Kasopoulou, says that we thought the war is Star Wars, and they were planning Mad Max. And Mad Max is capable of defeating Star Wars. So what they've been doing is they've been amassing an arsenal of rockets, the majority of which are primitive, of drones, the majority of which are primitive and therefore cheap, and planning a ring of fire, as Qassam Soleimani put it, around us, which will be able to defeat us in a war of attrition. And we got a very good example of how this can work on April 13th, the night of the first Iranian attack. By the time this airs, there might be a second attack. But we intercepted, along with our partners in the international coalition, almost all the rockets. The price for Israel was $1.5 billion. I don't know how much the rockets thrown at us cost, but probably just a fraction of this. And Iran and its proxies have been amassing huge quantities of these weapons, and they are capable of exhausting us mentally, militarily, but first and foremost economically. We will not be able to withstand $1.5 billion of defense every night.
So if you had to pinpoint that mistake, what would you say in a word?
The mistakes Israel made were tactical in this war. We should have gone first for the Philadelphia corridor and not last for the Philadelphia corridor. We discovered that our military is not up to the task. We discovered that we were cocky and arrogant and thought that we can rely wholly on technology, and therefore relied on SIGINT, signal intelligence, rather than human sources, and we knew nothing of what was happening there. And the information that
By there, you're referring to Gaza.
To Gaza, yeah. We knew very little about what was going on in Gaza. And whatever information we did have, our intelligence officers dismissed. They all belonged to the Star Wars mentality and could not fathom that primitive technology and fanatic determination could defeat this machine that we were so proud of, which is the IDF. And so there's the tactical mistake was not going for the Philadelphia corridor, but the larger mistake was the whole defensive philosophy of the IDF. We woke up on October 7th to discover that we don't have the right army for the wars that we're going to fight in this region. Our generals have been talking for 2 decades now about a small, smart army. Disappointed Israelis now say that we have a small, stupid army, and that is inflexible and does not understand what the task it has is. We thought that technology would solve all the problem, and we have reduced our ground forces to an inadequate force. So if war had erupted on the north border, along with the eruption or the invasion of Hamas in the south, we did not have enough armored divisions to fight on 2 fronts. What we must understand now is that we need to reconstruct our army and go back to basics, which means large armed forces. You don't solve everything with slurry walls, cyber intelligence, and sophisticated F-35s.
How do you think Hamas views the outcome and aftermath of October 7th? Was it a success in their eyes?
I think it's not yet been determined. I think what we in the West think of the terrible price that they paid is not important to them. They are willingly sacrificing their own population. They're putting them in harm's way. They've used all this money they received from the international community in order to build an underground terror city, but not one bomb shelter for their population. They're using their populations as fodder for their propaganda machine. And the more innocent people die, the happier they seem to be, or they think of that as an advantage. And we don't follow their theology at all. We don't take them seriously. The West is full of that. We're full of talk about the other. We're full of talk about moral relativism and multiculturalism. But we don't take the other seriously. We just believe that they are all as multicultural as us and as liberal as us. And this is not true of Hamas. So for Hamas, losing buildings is nothing because they'll get money to reconstruct it. Losing lives is nothing because they believe these people are martyred and go to heaven. And so if we don't exact the price that they understand, which means first and foremost territory, then they will think of themselves as winners in this conflict. It could be worse. If Yahya Sinwar can emerge at the end of this war after some some hostage deal, which is really a form of surrender, or the hostage deals that they are talking about now, which include withdrawing the IDF, leaving the Philadelphia corridor, and leaving Hamas intact. If Yahya Sinwar can get out at the end of this war, out of a tunnel, and make the V sign for victory, he will be Saladin for the next 1,000 years for Muslims in this area, and we would be doomed. So if we want to take seriously this war, the existential danger that we face, and the ideology of Hamas, then the right thing to do will be to annex all the north of the Gaza Strip, because in their theology...
We'll get to questions to talk more about that.
But let me just finish this. In their theology, the only viable reason to lay down your jihad weapons is if that endangers Muslim territory.
What do you look for in deciding which Knesset party to vote for?
First of all, Zionism. I think the left is increasingly post-Zionist. This is what I refer to as Sweden in Hebrew. That's not enough. So when I say Zionism, I mean the view that thought that the key to normalizing Jewish existence is not to eradicate differences between Jews and others, but rather to exercise self-determination like other peoples. So the core of Zionism, and I guess my most basic demand of any party, is to adhere to this from our Declaration of Independence. It is the natural right of the Jewish people to be like all peoples, masters of their own fate in their own sovereign state. That is the moral bedrock of Zionism. It's like the second paragraph of the American Declaration of Independence.
Which is more important for Israel, Judaism or democracy?
I think that they are intertwined in such a way that in order to reduce the Jewish character of the state, you need to reduce democracy. So long as you have a Jewish majority and a universal suffrage, then Shabbat will be your day of rest. Hebrew will be your first official language. Your calendar will be based on Jewish holidays, and your symbols will be drawn from the Jewish tradition. And hopefully you would also preserve the narrative on which Jewish identity for secular people is based. So in order to make this state less Jewish, you need to make it less democratic. And this is what has been happening for a long time. Israel is hardly a democracy. It is a juristocracy. We have a situation in which the judicial branch exercises full superiority over the elected branches of government, and these people are ultra progressives. So being progressive is being less democratic. They think that they can impose their view, which borders on the idea of a non-Jewish state of all its citizens. Basically, it's the local branch of globalism. We have that view entrenched in the court. And of course, the litmus test for that is that they are extremely lenient with everything that has to do with illegal immigration, most of which is, of course, non-Jewish, because Jewish immigration is ipso facto legal in this country. So the more you reduce democracy, you reduce the Jewish character of Israel.
So I'm actually very curious, because we spoke about this a little bit before when we were setting up and we were chatting. Naturally, when thinking about the question of democracy, some people are thinking of judicial reforms, overhaul, whatever people term it as. That happened about actually a year ago. For this time, it was underway. I'm curious if you can talk briefly about how you think that factors into this conversation.
How judicial reform factors
into your consideration about the question of Judaism and democracy in terms of which is more important for Israel.
First, I need water.
Yeah, of course.
I was very much engaged in the struggle over judicial reform. I've been against judicial activism.
Can you very briefly just describe, for those who may not be familiar, judicial reform? What does that entail in your understanding?
The question of judicial reform and the struggle around it is terribly misunderstood outside Israel, because the reform that Yariv Levin laid out, on my podcast, by the way, in full, was intended to democratize Israel after years of encroachment by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has been gathering more and more powers and authorities. It's been maneuvering very smartly inside Israel political institutions, transferring more and more powers of decision from elected branches of government to the Supreme Court. So the judicial reform was intended to return sovereignty to Israel's citizens. That was clearly understood by everyone on the right. But the left, which also controls the media, portrayed this as an attack on human rights in an attempt to clip the wings of the Supreme Court. In reality, it was an attempt to bring Israel closer to other normal democracies in which the center of decision-making is in electoral politics and therefore remains in the hands of citizens. But the combination of the identity of the coalition parties and the control of the narrative by the press managed to scare many Israelis into thinking that this was a plot to, it now seems so ridiculous to say that I'm struggling not to smile, that this is a plot to create a messianic dictatorship. So you had these pictures of Smotrich and the ultra-Orthodox, and they were all conspiring to drown this bastion of human rights, the Supreme Court, the defender of minorities, in order to use the tyranny of the majority in order to create a messianic dictatorship. That was never true. This was a struggle by the shrinking left to preserve its advantage in power by making the one branch of government which represents, in terms of personalities, represents their views and has control of its own appointments over the other branches of government. So the left has managed to impose for years its policies in many important things by controlling the Supreme Court. The right now tried to change that anomaly in which a Supreme Court has more powers than in any democracy in Israel. And it ended up in such defeat. Now the Supreme Court has augmented its power. And I can tell you from the point of view of political science that they hold sovereignty in this country. They hold the final authority of decision on everything, including the writing of a constitution. That is, they control the rules of the game and the structure and the functioning of Israeli institutions.
So I want to circle back to the rest of the questions that we have, but just one brief follow-up. I'm curious, did you have any critique of how judicial reform was rolled out or what was proposed, or you were fully supportive of?
I thought it was way too mild. I thought it would change very little. And I still think so. Had it all been implemented, the Supreme Court would have ignored half of it. That said, it was not wise to do it in a declaration of war because that played into the hands of the other party. We should have learned from the sophisticated and sly Supreme Court chief. We don't have a chief justice. He's the president of the Supreme Court, he was for many years, Aaron Barak, in which he did everything clandestinely, quietly, and he Marbury versus Madison us to death. Every time he did this, it was the same structure. He would yield the question, he would yield the issue at question while nailing his authority to decide it. So at every step, he bribed the other side with a nugget and amassed more authority. And if you want just one example of how it went, when he declared that the Supreme Court has the right of judicial review and can strike down legislation of the parliament, which is a completely novel idea that he invented, as John Marshall did, by the way. He invented for himself, only less plausibly, in Israel. First of all, he did it in the middle of the Shiva for Rabin. Nobody was paying attention. There is a page of Yediot Achronot in which there is a a little title, a little story at the bottom saying that the Supreme Court declared it has the power to strike down legislation under a huge picture of Arafat coming to console Leah Rabin, the widow of the slain prime minister. And that too, he declared that right, but didn't use it. He didn't use it yet. So we should have been smart enough to do it like this. Not declare total war and complete rehaul, but rather start moving effectively to change the balance of power.
What role should the Israeli government have in religious matters?
Very little. I don't think that it's the business of the government to intervene in religion. And when we say a Jewish democratic state, we don't mean that the state has a Jewish religion. Jewish in the phrase Jewish and democratic means its national character. It's like Italian, not like Catholic. So Israel doesn't have a church state. People don't know it because they think, I mean, England has a church state, right? There's the Anglican Church. But Israel has no formal religion and no formal state. It does have a rabbinate, and people are rarely aware of the fact that this comes from the Ottoman Empire, not from the Zionist enterprise. And this is part of a mixture of state and churches, or state and religions, not state and religion, because there are parallel institutions to the rabbinate for Christians and for Muslims. This is the millet system that we inherited from the Ottoman Empire through the British mandate that didn't cancel it, and Zionism left it in place.
Should Israel treat its Jewish and non-Jewish citizens the same?
It should, and it mostly does, except when there's a security risk.
Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah. People think that the Jewish state is somehow an anomaly, and they try to circle the alleged circle with the alleged square of how do you reconcile democracy with the fact that not all Israeli citizens are Jewish, and therefore it seems that some are excluded. But the issue is not religion, but nationality, and we are not unique. Almost all nation states have national minorities. Americans are prone to misunderstand this because their national identity is not based, as European national identity is, on a combination of a shared past and some kind of ethnicity, because it's an immigrant society. So the American sense of unity is based on a vision of the future, not a story about the past necessarily. But most European nations are like Israel. They're a combination of a shared past with some form of ethnic kinship, and therefore mostly they have national minorities. So if you go to Romania, you would have a large Hungarian minority. So how to treat minorities in nation states? The same goes for Italy. In South Tyrol, there's a large German-speaking minority. So no one asked Italians to stop being Italian in order to create a common identity that will include everybody in the states of all its citizens that would be non-national. What European countries do is they basically follow our example. And our example says that it is not enough to grant the minority personal, equal rights, but also you need to grant them the means to preserve their common identity. So if you want it in a metaphor, in Israel there is a whole system of schools in Arabic for the Arab population. There is no enforced assimilation. You get equal rights as individuals, and then the state provides you with equal means to preserve your identity. And if you look at what Europe did, there's a document called the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, and it basically follows the same pattern. It says equal individual rights, but the minority should get its equal share. If you have a budget for religious institutions, then a religious minority should get its equal share according to its size in the population. It should have schools in its own language and so forth. So the model is, I think, very clear, and Israel follows a beaten path. The problem is that the Arab minority in Israel is in parts, larger parts than we like to admit, hostile. In May 21, what was known as the Shomer Chomot, I don't want to use the term pogrom, although parts of it were like that. The riots that we experienced, some of which were murderous, and some of the Jews who got in the way of the riots were lynched. And they were lynched based on a Hamas-like ideology, which, by the way, the Palestinian Authority shares. So the question, the problem is that some of the minority in Israel do not recognize the right of the majority to self-determination. So it's a tricky question because obviously the majority is stronger, but we are not a majority in the region. And we know now that we are in danger. And part of the problem is that Israel has been way too extravagant in its tolerance towards ideological hostility within the minority. So according to Israeli law, it's a basic law, so it's one of our semi-constitutional laws. The basic law, Knesset, clause 7a, 7 aleph, says that you can't run for the Knesset if you are active against the Jewish or the democratic character of the state. This had been used to strike down ultra-Jewish nationalists, but never ultra-Arab nationalists. And so we have in the Knesset parties openly calling for the destruction of the Jewish state, which is illegal, was banned by the Committee on Elections, the Knesset Committee on Elections, but forced on us by the Supreme Court, which said of some of these that are, verging on genocidal ideology, well, that there is not yet a critical mass for deciding that they are not abiding by the law. But we have parties that shouldn't be in the Knesset that are openly calling for the destruction of the Jewish state, which harbor clear anti-Semitic views, which say that only the Jews do not have a right to self-determination, and thinking that in a democracy it's automatic that the majority is secure. We did not move against these parties, and I think that we are letting the situation deteriorate and may eventually face a civil war.
Now that Israel already exists, what's the purpose of Zionism?
Zionism is the national deliberate the national or the Jewish manifestation of the universal right to self-determination, to national self-determination. So for me, this is like asking, now that the American promise had been fulfilled with independence, is there still reason to support the Declaration of Independence? Yes, there is, because the values remain the guiding compass for the American polity. And it's the same for Israel. Our Declaration of Independence, which is an articulation of Zionism, is as valid and as important, and it still should guide us. And this project can go off the rails. It has gone off the rails, as you probably know by now, that I think by a Supreme Court which is undermining our basic civil rights as citizens in a democracy. And so I want to point out that we should go back to the values of Zionism as articulated in our Declaration of Independence.
Is opposing Zionism inherently anti-Semitic?
It isn't if you oppose all movements of national self-determination. So if you're a globalist and think that nationalism is evil and all nation states should be abolished, then if you think that Israel should also be abolished, that doesn't mean you're anti-Semitic. It just means you're very naive. But if you think all peoples have a right to self-determination except the Jews, and therefore all national ideologies, or most of them, or many of them, are legitimate, but somehow Zionism isn't, then that's anti-Semitic.
So we've asked this question to all of our guests, and we've had a listener who emailed in asking for a specific follow-up. So you'll actually be the first to get the follow-up. If someone says, I support, in theory, the Jewish movement for self-determination, but I don't want that to come at the expense of Palestinians, would you consider that an illegitimate form of opposing Zionism?
In the end, yes, because that means that you are opposed to Zionism in practice, because there's no way that it would not be on part of the territory which is the land of Israel, and therefore, if you're pro-Palestinian or if you adopt the Palestinian views, then any encroachment on the Palestinian territory is at their expense and is illegitimate. For many years, I supported a Palestinian state because I'm a Zionist. Because my Zionism is based on the right. And by the way, it's not. I did not invent this form of Zionism. Just to be clear, it's Herzl and Ben Gurion and many others thought exactly that this is a universal right for self-determination and it should be applicable to the Jews. But if you believe that this right is universal, then you can't implement it while denying it to another people. Asterisk, except if that is necessary for your security. And I would have had a Palestinian state if there was a Palestinian partner for peace. I foolishly supported the Oslo Accords believing there was such a partner. There never was. And I also foolishly supported the disengagement for Gaza, thinking that if they don't want independence, we can force them to have their own state. By the way, also for our egotistic reasons, because we want the original logic of the partition resolution of the United Nations was divide the land in such a way that you could preserve a Jewish majority on one side and an Arab majority on the other, and therefore both will be able to exercise the right for self-determination. What happened is that we discovered that we have been wrongly imagining the Palestinian national movement in our image, as if their goal was national self-determination, and it isn't. Their goal is the destruction of Israel. And their religious views, which I emphasize again and again, we keep ignoring, is a vision of redemption in which the end of days will only come after the last Jew is dead. So if your Palestinian Authority issues that hadith, that part of the Muslim tradition, 2 weeks after October 7th, 2 weeks after October 7th, this is the Palestinian Authority, this is not Hamas. And when its Ministry of Religion issues directions or recommendations for what imams should be saying on the coming Friday in their mosques, and they issue the hadith in which stones and trees say to the Muslims, "Oh Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." If that is what you issue from your Ministry of Religion to your imams, then there is no prospect of peace in the foreseeable future.
Which question do you think we're up to?
Now, 5, 7.
We're halfway through.
Oh, okay. That's not bad. 9.
Yeah, pretty good. You're the first person to underrate it. I've had people say, "Oh, we're done." I said, "No. Question 4."
No, I'm acutely aware of giving long answers.
Is the IDF the world's most moral army?
My friend, the comedian Roy Dan, says, yes, but it's the only one in the competition. No other army is so preoccupied with being moral at the expense of winning. Now,
is that a bad thing?
Yes, it is. If your obligation is to protect your citizens, not to be a saint, and war is often dirty. Should you be as moral as you can? Yes, but you cannot cross the line into the idiotic, unbelievably mechanic, ethic manual for the IDF written by my former teacher, Professor Asa Kasher, in which he says that the lives of enemy civilians are as important as yours, and therefore, if the price of killing combatants is innocent civilians, then you should not take that action. What this means is that if terrorists are going to hide behind innocent civilians, then they will win. That is your moral code for the Israeli army. That is a very stupid moral code. And as my friend Dan Shiftan has said repeatedly, this war is a test. It is a test of whether barbarians can use your moral views in order to defeat you. It is a test of whether a civilized nation can win over barbarians. And if you paralyze yourself with the ethical code of Asa Kasher, then that means you're letting the barbarians win in order to preserve some image of yourself. That said, if you look at this conflict, and I saw, Kamala Harris and others saying the terrible price that the Gazans are paying, this terrible price should be laying at their door. And according to international law, if you use civilians as human shields, their blood is on your hands. It is not an obligation of the other army not to attack your military targets if you put civilians in harm's way. And after they do that, still, in this conflict, we have the lowest ratio of civilian deaths to combatant deaths in any modern urban theater of warfare. What is recognized is the accepted average is about 7 to 9 dead civilians for every dead soldier. And what we have in this conflict, according to Israeli and American estimates, is somewhere between 1.5 civilians to 3 civilians for every Hamas fighter. That is an unbelievably low ratio when you take into account the fact that this is one of the densest areas on the planet, and that the Hamas barbarians are using their own women and children and elderly and men as shields.
If you were making the case for Israel, where would you begin?
I am sad that the case is not self-evident. If I had to present it now to the world, I'd stand behind Netanyahu's last speech before the joint session of the two houses of Congress. I think he put it exactly right when he said that this is not just Israel's war. This is the war of civilized nations against barbarism. He alluded to Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, and he said, this is not a clash between civilizations. This is a clash between barbarism and civilization. And therefore, I think Israel should make the case that it has not just the right of self-defense. It is now fighting against a monstrous axis of terror, which has as its goal the destruction of the whole West, which harbors unbelievably sadistic and barbaric mores and values, and that we should stand firmly against them. And now, as Colonel Richard Kemp said, I think wisely, this is the war between the West and Iran, and only Israel is fighting it.
Can questioning the actions of Israel's government and army, even in the context of this war, be considered a valid form of love and patriotism?
Of course. In a democratic, liberal polity, it's your obligation to speak truth to power, always. But then this turned, in some circles, the ideal of self-criticism as a moral ideal has turned into the habit that self-flagellation is somehow a moral virtue, and that is very childish and stupid.
What do you think is the most legitimate criticism leveled against Israel today?
Against Israel or against Israel's government?
against Israel? And you can answer it however you understand the question.
So most of the criticisms leveled against Israel are dishonest now. So if I try to sift through them in my head, I don't think any of them I would consider very valid. I think Israel should take care to preserve its to be faithful to its own values, and that does not mean self-flagellation. It also does not mean tying your own hands or sacrificing your own soldiers in order to satisfy a double standard of other nations. Let me point out that when the coalition led by the United States attacked ISIS, they flattened huge parts of Raqqa and Mosul from the air without ever bothering to separate civilian population from combatants. So since most of the criticism of Israel is directed there, I reject it. I think Israel is careful to preserve civilian life, sometimes too careful when it sacrifices too many of its own soldiers. I would criticize Israel for not understanding early enough what it is that we are facing. But that can be a critique of our own government. Among the nations, their double standards applied to our wars are absolutely disgusting and often motivated by anti-Semitism. So that I flatly reject. But I think that Israel did not understand early enough what the danger is and what its role can be. I think that we haven't been vigilant enough in the face of anti-Semitism, and we should have called out the rot in Western Academy, including our own, much earlier. I was not in the least surprised by the eruption of pro-Hamas demonstrations on American campuses. What do you expect if your saint is Edward Said for 40 years and all your students are indoctrinated by a view in which the defense of Zionism runs against the methodological assumption of the field? So if you go to post-colonial studies, you can't defend Zionism unless you volunteer to be a racist and to be labeled a racist. And if everything is framed in such a way, then the whole edifice is rotten, and Israel should have stood up against it domestically and internationally.
So this is my only follow-up for this question, and then we'll move on. Has there been anything you've heard criticizing Israel or Israel's government, however you want to understand the question, that you felt, even if you don't fully agree with it, that there's some aspect of it that you do think is legitimate?
Yes, I think that we have been very stupid to cooperate with the international institutions that pretend to dispense justice when what they are doing is political anti-Semitism, and I'm sometimes embarrassed by the fact that American senators like Ted Cruz, like Tom Cotton, are better at articulating our cause than we are.
Do you think peace between Israelis and Palestinians will happen? I'm laughing because you've kind of already alluded to this. But do you think peace between Israelis and Palestinians will happen within your lifetime?
Oh, that's a ridiculous idea. Look at what's going on in their school books. The school books that inflamed passions of Hamas are, by the way, school books from the Palestinian Authority, not from Hamas. So the indoctrination begins there. And if you look at the books, I just reviewed for Tablet a book by my friend Lital Shemesh called How Much is a Dead Jew Worth?, in which she surveys Palestinian culture. Who are the heroes of Palestinian culture? Only people who kill Jews. These are the only heroes. These are the names of the streets, the names of squares, the names of institutions are all after shaheeds, martyrs, people who killed Jews. The Palestinian Authority has a substantial part of its budget dedicated to the families of martyrs, people who killed Jews, or people sitting in Israeli jails. The longer the sentence you get, the more harm you did to Jews, the more money you get monthly. Take then the school books, and you will see that even a question of physics is used in order to indoctrinate anti-Semitism. So you'd be faced with a question: at what speed should a 50-kilo rocket fly from Gaza in order to hit Tel Aviv at such and such a time? And then if you have your grammar lessons, then the sentences they use to demonstrate grammar, this is an actual example. Never allow yourself to think that the occupier is human. So if you indoctrinate children from kindergarten playing with guns at killing Jews, then peace will not come. I'll say it very minimally. This is the most optimistic that I can get. If now a 3-year-old in kindergarten is taught to play killing Jews instead of playing, house as they do, in Western kindergartens, then as long as this kid is part of the adult population of Gaza, there will be nothing to talk about. And all our dreams of peace have just been self-deception.
So I'll take that as a no.
It is a no, yes.
What do you think should happen with Gaza and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict after the war?
Let's start with occupation. How's that? As I said, I think we should annex a third of the north third of the Gaza Strip, so that the price is going to be substantial. I think it's ridiculous to assume that we can transfer authority to a Palestinian Authority. I think that the idea that our not very sophisticated Minister of Security, Mr. Gallant, says that we will somehow nurture local authorities is not workable in the short run. So we need to completely eradicate Hamas's military and governing abilities. And then the question is asked, who will take their place? So in the short run, definitely only the IDF. And it should be such a level of control that we can also control what is in their school books. So the only hope is stopping indoctrination. No one else will do it. If anyone trusts an international coalition, I would refer them to Security Council Resolution 1701, which was supposed to solve the problem of Hezbollah on our north border. That's 2006 after the war, or 7. And we see what the international forces have done there. Nothing. So the first thing is we cannot outsource Israeli security. We should, by the way, while I'm sounding hawkish, we should also dismantle the Palestinian Authority, which is a terror authority that has built an army, not a police force. We are in danger of another October 7 from their side. And so we, in the foreseeable future, we should be running things until a different generation or some solution that I can't imagine in the present is thought, but is presented. But since the Hamas, the idea said at the beginning of this war that Hamas is also the enemy of the population. The population supports Hamas. We have abundant evidence that a majority of Palestinians, by the way, more on the West Bank than in Gaza, supported the Hamas massacre of October 7 and were happy with it. So as long as this is the situation, this is not a population that we can again trust. In the that's for the near future, the next few years. Later, we can start delegating local, that is municipal-like authority to Palestinian locals, still under supervision, because I don't think that anything remotely like a state of independence can be tried again on our borders, because what I used to dismiss when Netanyahu said it would be a terror state. We on the left, I was on the left, said, these right-wing pessimists, clingers, they don't see optimism. They don't understand that all peoples just want to come home in the evening and hug their children and have food on the table. So we have been underestimating religious fanaticism. Israel is a very small island of Western values and democracy in a huge sea of political lava, which is very dangerous. The Arab region called the Middle East, the Muslim Arabs are in a civilizational crisis, the likes of which I don't think is familiar to us from recorded history. No form of political order has survived in the Arab world. And so we've tried monarchies, they've tried monarchies, Arab socialism, pan-Arabism, political Islam, nationalism, nation states. All these forms of political order have collapsed. What was called the Arab Spring, which turned out to be the Muslim winter, is a tragedy, because we then understood that nation states are not a viable form of political order in the Arab world. And what have we been left with? Political lava, which produced ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and other fanatic sects. So Israel, under no conditions, can have a branch of that wild growth next to our kibbutzim. And certainly we can't leave the mountain ridge of Judea and Samaria, because then there will be territorial continuity from the outskirts of Tel Aviv all the way to Tehran. That is out of the question.
So 3 brief questions on your point of annexation. When you say annexation, do you mean all of Gaza or part of Gaza?
No, I said occupation, not annexation.
Oh, you meant occupation, not annexation.
No, I said annex the north third of the Gaza Strip.
And so, would you, in that view of annexation, what do you think, or what do you believe would happen with the Gazan civilians or Palestinians who are there? And then B, would you also support Israelis moving back there, back into that annexed?
Well, in the long run, yes. In the short run, I don't know. The third part of the Gaza Strip has more or less been emptied of population. It's a war zone. So the little that remains there can be gradually maybe incorporated into Israel, if this is a very small number. Other than that, the Gazans can make their new home in the south of the Gaza Strip.
Are political and religious divides a major problem in Israeli society today?
Yes, I think there is the problematic issue of how to integrate the Haredim, especially the extreme sector of the Haredim. We have an economic problem that we need to solve in the long run, and it has to do with the controversy over the draft to the military, because the current situation is one in which, in order not to be drafted, you need to be registered as a student. And if you work, a student at a kollel, and if you're registered as a student, you can't work, because then you lose your army waiver. So we have a whole population which is basically unable to work and can't support itself. That's one divide. And the second very serious divide is that we have an increasingly alienated and alienating progressive elite, which you can now see rioting in the streets in the middle of an existential war, and which has for a long time constructed its own identity on alienation to Israel, Israelis, and Judaism. So this is a progressive, globalist-leaning elite which sees itself, which identifies more with its counterparts in other nations than with its own countrymen. I've written a book about that. So it was long before judicial reform or the war.
Which book are you referring to?
Nayadim v'Nayachim.
It's in Hebrew.
It's in Hebrew. It's called The Mobile and the E-Mobile. I'm working for a long time on an English translation along with Peter Berkowitz, who did the original draft of the translation. But things are moving so fast. So if I have a long chapter on the judiciary in the book, but that was written before the struggle over judicial reform and before the war. And it's almost irrelevant now. I mean, it's the prehistory of what is happening now. So I'm struggling to catch up with events. But the book, the title that I thought I should give it in English was Globalist Elites and National Citizens. So we have a globalist elite, which is a progressive elite like in other places, which considers most of the rest of us as deplorable, and is attempting to distance itself from us. And that is creating a rift because that elite controls the press, controls academia, and has a large chunk of Israeli high-tech economy also in its hands, and its commitment to the common cause is very flimsy. Now, that said, that elite is small. It has many fellow travelers, which someone told me after I wrote the book, these are not nayadim, they're not really mobile, they imagine themselves to be mobile. And because I tried to define them also sociologically as people who can make a living with their profession elsewhere. So maybe you can make a living on your laptop, so it doesn't matter if you're here or on a beach in Thailand. And maybe you're a university professor and you can teach somewhere else. And maybe you're a high-tech entrepreneur and it doesn't matter where you live. But most people say a physician is by this definition nayad. You can take your profession elsewhere, but it's not that simple, right? If you want to be a physician in Hungary now, it's not that easy to just open a clinic without speaking the language, without knowing people, or so the actual class of mobile individuals is small, but it carries weight because a lot of Israel's elite identify themselves in that way, and they see their ideal of what a normal Western individual should look like basically demands transcending Judaism. So their concept of normality is once you overcome your Jewishness. And that is at its core anti-Zionist, because this is a very diasporic view, right? I will blend in by minimizing all Jewish attributes of my identity. And I think since it's a small minority, but since it exercises a lot of cultural weight, it is dangerous to the common enterprise.
This is our last two questions.
Uh-huh.
Where do you identify on Israel's political and religious spectrum? And do you have friends on the quote-unquote other side?
I identify with Likud. I identify as a nationalist, a Democrat, and a liberal in the original sense. I abhor identity politics. I think that's a retrograde and regressive view. I respect religion. I envy people who believe, because I think humans need consolation, and if you're secular, you don't have that. I'm thinking, where would I send my children to school when I have them? And I tend to think of a religious school, because what is going on in secular schools is Judaism is disappearing to be substituted by some abstract humanity, general human rights, and formal citizenship. So that's where I stand culturally and politically. Do I have friends on the other side? All my friends used to be on the other side. I always had some friends on the right. I wasn't in the boycott camp. Many of my friends boycott me, many of my former friends. My dearest and closest friends mostly did not. Some when there's someone radical on the other side, we have agreements not to talk about politics. That doesn't always work, but some friends have become actual enemies and have been really attacking me, sometimes wildly, on social media or on press interviews. One who was my partner in editing, I think maybe 25 volumes of a periodical we edited together, had begun to slander me on publicly, which is, I don't know. That's not my conception. Friendships should not be dependent on political views, but some friendships are purely political, and then they fray when politics drive you apart.
It sounds very hard. I'm sorry to hear that. And our last question: do you have more hope or fear for Israel and the Jewish people?
Do you mean in the short run or in the long run?
I'll let you take the question however you want to receive it.
In the short run, I'm very worried. In the long run, I think Israelis and Jews in general have not only historically shown incredible resilience, but we saw it in the aftermath of October 7th. I used to think, as a cultural critic, I used to think that this generation is self-indulgent. They photograph their food in order to fake glamour on Facebook or Instagram. And then this war broke out, and it turned out that they are lions. I saw this interview with this guy who lost his leg. It was on social media. It was not on television. And the interviewer, a woman, asked him, well, what do you want to do now? And he said, do you see this wheelchair? I want to install an iron bar here with a machine gun, and I want to go back. And you think, wow, these people, they are fierce. They are really fierce. A friend of mine, Ran Baratz, wrote a piece called The Spirit of 48. And when you look at what they say, they have this phrase. I mean, it's very emotional. They say, "Lo noflim midor tashach." It's grammatically awkward, so in English it works the same. Not falling short of the 48 generation. That's a tall order. My father lost his hand in one of the first battles of the war and remained a fierce patriot. And these people are as fierce, and that's amazing. We have a defeatist set of brass in the IDF, but we have lions for soldiers. And when things get tough, and I predict they will get tough, then these are the people we should rely on. Because if you would let me say on ending, I don't think that this is just 1948. I think this is 1956. 1956 was the first war that we waged when we understood that Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the dictator of Egypt, was tying a noose around Israel by attempting to unite the Arab world against us and encircle us. And we fought 4 wars in order to break that noose. The War of 56, the Sinai Campaign, the Suez War as it is known internationally, the 6 Days War, the War of Attrition, the Yom Kippur War, and finally, after a sea change in politics, we managed to dismantle that noose. We are now in 56. This is the first war to dismantle the Iranian noose that has been closing around us while we were sleeping on our nose. And we are facing what I think is at least a decade of wars until we break that noose. And we had better be ready for that.
All right, well, Gadi Taub, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for answering our 18 questions.
Thank you for your patience.